Hello everybody! Today I'm in our natural tea gardens in Jingmai Mountain. I'm about 4 kilometers west of the main village of Jingmai in a place called Yunnan, and we have tea gardens there, natural tea gardens. And it's early spring 2018, and so today I want to talk a bit about the growth cycle. As you know, there are several harvests a year, so I'm gonna give a bit more details about how it works. So first you have to know that in the world most of the tea gardens go through a dormancy period in winter. Under special conditions, like if you have irrigated gardens and things like that, you can avoid the dormancy period. But in Jingmai, at least, all of the tea trees during winter enter dormancy. Now, what does it mean? During dormancy, you have a dormant bud at the tip of the shoots, okay? This dormant bed is protected by two little kind of small leaves, but a bit thicker than leaves. You could say it's kind of scale, and it will remain like this throughout winter. Now then, in early spring, as temperature increases, there's a kind of internal clock in the tea tree which is related to temperature. And when the tea tree decides it's time to stop dormancy, to start growing leaves, it's going to release hormones in the through the shoots and into the leaves, and those buds will become active. What it means is that at the top of the buds you have things called meristems, and they're going to start producing new cells. So those meristems, they divide and divide and divide, and you have new cells growing. They start very small when they are divided, and they grow as they do photosynthesis and develop. They get bigger and bigger. So what you have to remember is that the end of the dormancy is heavily determined by temperature. If you have a hot winter, you will have an earlier harvest than if you have a cold winter, okay? Because that internal clock in the tea tree is linked to temperature, and this is true for all the plants, okay? So development, what we call development, is the act of having a new bud, having a new leaf. It's always conditioned by temperature. Now this development can also be slowed down due to stress. For example, if the tea tree is lack of water or nutrients, it might slow down development. So for example, some tea trees that are under stress will typically sprout later than tea trees which don't lack of water or nutrients. Pruning also has an influence. If you prune the tea trees, for example, during the winter, or if you pruned it the year before, it's gonna sprout earlier than if you don't prune it. Typically, at the beginning of the season, we start harvesting the pruned tea trees first. Also, there's a relationship between the age of the trees, actually, and the earliness. So if the tea trees are young, they will sprout early. They will have a shorter dormancy. It means at the end of autumn, they will sprout until quite late into autumn, and will sprout. So we'll have a short dormancy, maybe just 2 months, 2 or 3 months, and then we'll sprout very early in spring. Typically in Jingmai, we start having new buds as soon as late February, okay? But now if you go to the ancient tea gardens or older natural tea gardens, which typically have have older tea trees in those gardens, then it typically comes out throughout March, or for the biggest and oldest trees in Jingmai Mountain, they can sprout as late as April. Usually early April. So the start of the season goes like this. You start by having a little bit of tea every day. You start typically in late February, and then you get more and more tea coming out as you go into March, okay? And the real peak season really starts in late March. But again, it depends on the year. It depends on the temperature during winter and early spring. So in 2018, I could say it's fairly early. At least it's earlier than 2017. We're now in mid-March, and we already have quite a lot of tea gardens. like the tea garden behind me has been harvested once already. There's another point I want to make. Since we have different genetics, those tea trees were planted by seeds, so remember that each tea tree has its own gene pool, and it means it also has an influence on earliness, okay, of the sprout. So some tea trees will sprout earlier than others, okay? So especially on the first flush, on the first time you're going to pick the tea during the season, you will have like sporadic sprouts of tea buds in your tea gardens. Not all of the tea trees will sprout at the same time. And it's important actually to pick those tea trees, well, as soon as they sprout, or as soon as you consider that the flush developed enough, okay? If you don't do that, what's going to happen is typically the first flush is going to grow fully, and then there won't be a next flush. Actually, the tea tree will prefer to grow flowers and fruits to reproduce, because remember, the first goal in life is reproduction. And if the tea tree considers it's safe, its own survival is safe, then it's gonna want to reproduce. And we don't want this as tea farmers, because making flowers and fruits takes up a lot of resources, and usually when they make flowers, they don't make leaves, and of course we want the tea leaves, okay? So it's very important to pick the first buds that come out, well, the first flush that come out. Usually in early spring you have to go pick tea several times in the same tea garden. Maybe over 2 weeks you're going to go a lot to one tea garden and pick the sporadic sprouts that you get. Later in the season the tea trees tend to adjust, so I don't know exactly why. It might be related to some hormones released in the tea gardens that kind of set a common clock for all the tea trees. But typically after the first flush, well, the tea trees tend to sprout quite at the same time. So now that was for the dormancy and how early or late it is, and yeah, how the start of the season works. Now during the season your bud is growing and it's going to unfold into a leaf. And inside this leaf, actually at the base of the bud, so the bud grows, it opens, and at the base of the bud you have another bud actually. So that former bud becomes a leaf, and that small bud that's inside the new leaf is going to grow and open again and reveal a new small bud. The bud kind of unfolds into a new leaf. And this cycle can go usually up to 5 leaves. Like once you have like 5 or 6 leaves, at the end of the last leaf there's like a very, very small bud that's going to wait for some time before sprouting again, okay? So that cycle, all the shoots, the new shoot that grows and the leaves attached to them is called a flush, okay? So every time you pick the tea, you pick a flush, like this. So at the start of the flush, like you have your first bud, and depending on many factors like soil fertility, pruning, stress and things like that, and temperature, the buds are unfolding at different rates. But usually in the natural tea gardens you get one new leaf every day, okay? So if you come to your tea garden and you see you have new buds sprouting but no leaf yet, then maybe you might want to come back in 3 or 4 days just to pick the tea. At that time you will have a harvestable flush, okay? Now what's typically done during picking is to leave at least one fully grown leaf on the tree so as to sustain photosynthesis for the general health of the tea tree and its productivity, okay? If you don't do that, then that's called over harvesting. You don't want to let the flush grow fully, otherwise it's going to take a long time before you get the next flush, okay? It's because well, by picking the tea when the flush is still growing, you kind of stress the tea tree, like you tell it its leaves are being attacked or something like that, and it's going to want to produce leaves at a higher rate, okay? If you don't pick the leaves before the end of the growth cycle, then the tea tree is going to go through a kind of small dormancy. So either the next flush, it will continue producing leaves, but the next flush will be delayed by a couple of weeks. Either it will start to grow flowers and fruits for reproduction. Okay, you don't want that to happen, so it's important to keep the pace with harvesting, to keep the harvesting pace, so to be able to pick the tea trees as the new flushes come out. And sometimes that can be hard because we can have too many gardens and maybe a shortage of workforce during some peak production times, and it can occur that we don't have time to harvest some of the tea gardens. So we know in that case that the next harvest will be delayed. And for example, that's why it's important to harvest the leaves during summer. If you don't harvest the leaves during summer, then you will get less leaves actually in autumn. So sometimes you think like, oh, those summer leaves are so cheap, why do people bother pick them? It's to make sure that they don't grow fruits and flowers, and to make sure they have a good production, a sustained production in autumn, at which time the leaves are more expensive. So typically after you pick the flash, a new bud is going to grow on the shoot, and that's going to take maybe a couple of weeks. It depends on your management and the healthiness of the tea tree, and then you will have a new cycle again. So for example, in our natural tea gardens, we typically pick tea 10 to 15 times a year. It really depends on soil fertility, on whether you prune it or not, and on temperature. Okay, in the most intensive plantations, they can have one harvest almost every week, and sometimes you have up to 30-40 times a year tea is picked. I'm talking for the Assamica varietal. Okay, for the Sinensis varietal, the small leaf varietal, they have a much lower yield, a much lower number of flushes per year. Okay. But well, for example, when we talk about Darjeeling tea and first flush and second flush, you have to understand actually the first flush. During the first flush, the tea trees are actually picked many times. So they call it first flush and second flush, but it's not exactly true if you look at how the tea tree grows. You know, you can pick it many times. So at the end of the season, the tea tree will go dormant. That's also related to temperature. When temperatures go down, there's something controlled by hormones again that will tell the tea tree to just keep the buds dormant and go over the winter. So now we're in the ancient tea gardens, and you can see that here, so we're mid-March now, and very few tea trees have sprouted, and those that tend to sprout are usually smaller trees. You can see this one is now sprouting, and it will probably be harvestable in like 4 or 5 days. So typically the tea leaves in the ancient tea gardens grow a bit slower than in the natural tea gardens. This is probably due to a difference in temperature, because we have some heavy shade here, and also a difference in the age of the trees, as I mentioned before, and also very likely a difference in size of the trees. I will talk about the size of the trees in a later video. But what we know from the ancient tea gardens is that we can typically harvest them six times a year, from late March to November. Yeah, November, October. Okay, while I remind you, the natural tea gardens, it tends to be around 12 times a year, 10 to 15 times, depending on the location of the gardens, and it goes from late February to late November. Okay, so that's about it for today. Now we're gonna go back home and make tea, because we're in early spring, and that's the time you need to be in Jingmai as a tea maker. So thanks for watching, and please leave me more questions in the comment sections, and put a nice thumb up to the video, and subscribe to our channel. I will see you next time, and hopefully answer as best as I can to your questions. Bye bye.